Hello and welcome to Season 2, Episode 3 of What So What Now What. Ravi, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you, Tim. How are you today?
Very good, very good. The winter even has been very kind to us.
Yeah, I mean, I went outside to the shops to get something at lunchtime, and it was sort of like basking in the glory of the sun with a tinge of sadness that, climate change. It's like, this is great, but it's February. This is fantastic weather, but global warming's a thing because it was snowing this time last year. I think it was Snowmageddon around this time, if you remember.
Yeah, it was actually. Yeah, it was. It's crazy.
Exciting. But...
Oh God. We've had a couple of episodes in the last couple of weeks. We had the last one on data viz literacy, and we had some follow up, didn't we?
Yeah, it was really good feedback from our listeners, which grew, and lots of people from different ranges. And we're sort of getting out from the people that we're following, and it's now seeing like other people's friends and other people getting involved and listening in, which is really cool to see for us, because we're trying to be as focused on data and tech and things that we're interested in as possible. So it's good to see so many people listening and giving feedback and sharing the podcast. So thank you for that. And of course, if you have any feedback and any thoughts you want to share with us, absolutely send them to us. So like on Twitter, by DM, me and Tim are very easily, I think we've got fairly distinct names, so we're easy to find on other social networking and
LinkedIn, also in the show notes as well.
Yeah, and of course, it's in the show notes on how to get in touch with us and the various ways. We've got an email address as well, so you can email in as well. And yeah, as Tim mentioned, we did a couple. So on the back of that, we mentioned at the end of the episode, we were going to do a bonus episode about how we podcast, so how we're actually doing this, for example, today. And that dropped this week, so definitely go back and check that out if that's something that interests you.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, we kind of want to encourage more people to get involved with alternative ways of sharing content, whether it's a video, podcasting, blogs, whatever you're doing, just try and do something different.
Yeah, exactly. So what are we talking about today? What's our topic? We're on a bit this week, right?
We are. This is a bit week, and we're talking about NLP.
NLP, so that's neuro-linguistic processing?
That is the right acronym for that sort of subject matter, but it's also natural language processing, depending on what you want to talk about. So yeah.
Okay. So which one is it?
Today we're doing natural language processing.
Cool.
It's an area of sort of machine learning.
Yeah, and I think this comes at a nice time. Last week, Tableau, the software that me and Tim use very regularly, introduced 2019.1, which has a feature called Ask Data. And this basically came from Tableau acquiring a startup. So Tableau were thinking about natural language, but what they did to sort of kick it into place was buy this startup called ClearGraph. This was a couple of years ago now, and ClearGraph was sort of a capability which allowed you to ask questions of the data. So, for example, show me this week's transactions. Show me anything over £200, that sort of thing. And now that's now a feature as part of Tableau's offerings.
Exactly.
So it's quite a hot topic. Well, I wouldn't say hot topic, but it's something that's of interest to a lot of people at this moment in time. But I also think it's quite new, isn't it, Tim?
Yeah, it's quite new to the Tableau world. I have to say that this the first time I saw a feature like Ask Data wasn't in Tableau. It was actually in a demo of some Office 365 thing a couple of years ago.
Okay.
And it's funny because at the time, the interface was more or less the same as what we see today. But it got a lot of critique then. But now that it's appeared in our world, it happens to be new. So I don't think it's a new concept as per se, and especially not in the business intelligence world. But it's new to the Tableau sphere, and so naturally that allows us to have another round of conversations about its purpose, its meaning, and how it all works.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I think of natural language and sort of having a conversation with a computer, because that's what it is at a high level, right? You always think of assistants in some way, like they have to translate this. But enough of me trying to go off on a tangent, trying to figure out this in my head. So Tim, do you want to have a go at explaining at a high level how NLP works and what it is?
Okay, so this is it's I'm thinking back to our episode on hyper, and I'm trying to desperately try and keep this very very simple. Okay,
Yes,
um,
I'll try and keep you on
so
track as well.
so thank you. So NLP is essentially a subset of machine learning. So machine learning is this field of computer science where essentially computing tasks get too hard to program. So instead of programming it ourselves, we actually get computer technology to sort of start trying to make sense of things on our behalf. So we give it the basic tools that it needs to do, what it needs to do, and then
Right.
it goes off and makes meaning of that.
So,
Um,
so
yeah.
just on machine learning,
hmm
I think a really good way to think about it is tagging. It's sort of trying to
Yeah, that's a good
spot
shout. Yeah.
patterns and behaviors. And what machine learning really is, as you say, instead of trying to complicatedly program every single potential outcome, it's like saying, well,
hmm
how about I just open this up and then have a computer that just almost listens and tags similar behaviors, and then
Exactly.
there's this concept of training a machine learning model or machine learning program, and I guess this then feeds into natural language processing. Is that right?
Yeah, it's kind of like that, and the key thing here is that you know, when we talk about language, we're dealing with linguistics, so we're dealing with words, and machine learning is typically sort of focused around dealing with mathematical problems. So,
Mm-hmm.
when you type a query into Google, everything gets boiled down to numbers and computational maths takes over and then returns a response using mathematical models. And
Mm-hmm.
so with NLP, what we actually have to do in a lot of the cases is actually apply this computational linguistic sort of approach where we take words and we turn them into numerical values that then can then be understood by a typical machine learning model, and then also natural language processing specific models as well. So it's a bit of both.
So that's kind of like saying, if I say the cat sat on the mat, it's like classifying each one of these as with a unique identifier. Is that right? Like the number you're processing, saying as that processing number would be like taking each word as a tag and then also grouping it as a wider sentence as well. Is that correct?
Yeah. So let me dive into an easy example, maybe one that you might type into Google. So, who's the president of the United States? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now that question is I'm going to call this a top tier aim. So when you type that question into Google, you're looking for a response, and if you ask that question, you don't necessarily know the answer, so you're also looking to get an answer. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's sort of a top tier goal. So we got to remember that. What is the top tier sort of goal? And then the next thing that Google has to do is it's got to perform some tasks. So the first task is to read your text, understand the sentiment, understand that you mentioned a country, understand that you asked for a president, understand that you asked for who is the president with the term whose. So that's all called named entity recognition
Okay.
and relationship recognition. And then the very low bit, the lowest of low part of this process is actually understanding the individual parts, so the letters. So the way you've typed it, the sentiment where you typed it, the fact that you put a question mark on the end means that you want an answer back. So those are the sort of the three levels of a typical sort of natural language process.
Right. So I guess with that's I'm going to work backwards now from what you said. Right. So, so going to the lowest level, that could be like, did the Bears win this weekend? Right. So you're
Exactly.
saying the Bears, and then if that Bears is a small letter, it could just be just a regular bear, like the animal.
Yeah.
But then if you capitalize it, you're then making it an object, and that then the machine learning model then can pick that up, or the
Exactly.
NLP algorithm can pick that up as, okay, if it's a capitalized B, we might be referring to a sports team, right?
Yeah,
So a sports
exactly.
team or a group of people that are typically known as bears. So then that's the smaller part, right? And then, as you said, you've got the full stops, question marks, punctuation, all these different things that come into it. Of course, with Google, there's other stuff that comes into play, like apostrophes and was it double quotes for like exact phrases, but
exactly.
We don't want to get into that too much. But then you mentioned the level above. That's, I think you said medium level challenges.
Yeah, so mid-level tasks. Yeah.
Right. So this would be like saying, trying to figure out what you're trying to get out of it. Like, what would the objective of this statement, of this phrase be? So I think this is the meat of it, because if you think about, I mean, I think both of us have done some level of text analytics or text parsing, and
Yeah.
it's tricky, right? You always end up sort of using an API instead of trying to figure it out yourself,
Yeah, you
because
kind of you relegate it over there to the machine learning engine somewhere in the cloud, right?
yeah, because you then sit down and you realize, if anyone's done this, you sort of the approach you kind of take is, oh, okay, cool. Well, let me just I'll just create a couple of phrases, and then I can create a tagging system where it's like ones and zeros in columns, and then I can say like, this is the sort of thing that happens. Then you start thinking a bit more, and you're like, hang on, I need to get rid of stop words, so like all of this stuff. So the more detail you want, the more of this stuff you want to do. Like another example of annoying text analytics is I think fuzzy matching.
Yeah,
Fuzzy matching is so difficult, because it's like there are so many nuances, like names, places, as well as words, and then languages. It gets into a messy sort of stage. So this is where the sort of I'd say the magic happens with natural language.
And even fuzzy matching that you've just mentioned there, that actually uses some natural language processing specific models, things like the edit distance, to figure out the difference between whether you mean playing, plays, or played. As a very basic example, you might be using Microsoft Word and you might mistype something by one letter. That's another example of sort of machine learning or natural language processing happening in the background to try and figure out what it is you're actually trying to say, and therefore give you a spelling suggestion. Yep.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I didn't really think of that one. Like, there must have been someone way back when they created Microsoft Word and be like, we should have a spell check, and they've just loaded in the dictionary, and then the dictionary is that natural language machine learning thing, but it's sort of like machine learned, if that makes sense. It's like
exactly,
it's done its thing. It's got its database to refer against. But then what machine learning, when it comes into its own, is like I guess like your phone keyboard when you add a word. So I always have this issue with when I get a new computer or a new phone, I have to type in my name, and I always get the squiggly lines, because Ravi and Mystery is like, it's not in the English or US dictionary, so you have to sort of add it to dictionary, right, as a name. So I guess that's a form of natural language. And then nowadays, of course, with like Office 365, these applications are typically connected to the internet, so they're constantly picking up from a database. But natural language, I guess, comes in like on Gmail's new feature of trying to predict what you're about to say next based on your previous email writing habits.
Exactly. And so if you allow me to go one level deeper, and this is going to be pertinent when we start to try and talk about business intelligence.
I wouldn't try and stop
NLP.
you, Tim.
Okay, so when you have a natural language sort of process running, or when you're doing anything with natural language processing, you need to train it, as you rightly mentioned earlier on. Okay, and so what's typically done in the field is there's something called a corpus, and a corpus is just basically a group of documents. Okay, and if I give you an example, a corpus might be a list of news articles. Okay, so each news article is essentially a document. Another corpus might be, I don't know, Wikipedia articles of all presidents of the United States. So they're very narrow, they're very specific, but what they do is they allow the model to learn the language within that realm. So in the news articles, that realm will be very specific, and there's a whole sort of list of corpuses out there. And then inside of that document, inside of an article, let's say take a news article, you have essentially different things going on. The main one to really focus on is morphology. And morphology is essentially this concept where you're trying to understand the structure of a word and how that changes its meaning. Okay. Right. So if I take a very simple example, I could say that something is fantastic, or I could say that something is fantastically horrid. Right. Now, the latter example is actually quite hard for a computer to figure out, because if you were just doing sentiment analysis, you'd see the word fantastic and you'd give it a high score. Okay. Right. And then you might see horrid, but because I've said fantastic first, you might miss the sentiment, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah, I think I saw a talk on this, and the lady was like, I didn't really understand why this happened. And it's like, I think when you get into colloquialisms, this happens for sure, right?
Yeah,
because
exactly.
You could say this is sick.
Yeah.
And as a as a British person who understands that slang, sick
Yeah,
is a good thing. That's an awesome thing. It's unbelievable. It's incredible.
yeah, yeah.
Um, but then if I'm speaking to someone who's not a natural,
Non-native speaker.
non-native speaker, exactly, yeah,
Yeah,
the native, the word I was looking for. So a natural language model would have picked this up. um, yeah, so if someone's a non-native speaker, that they might question that and ask, why are you using the word sick? I thought that meant like, ill, or when you are
yeah,
physically sick,
yeah,
Um,
exactly. And the sick even has this sort of verbal sort of sound that follows its meaning. So it's
yeah.
not only just a word, but yeah, it
But
carries a lot with it.
yeah, but then I mean, if we talk about when you're speech to text sort of thing, right? Speech to
Yeah.
text might in the future start picking up intonations. Now, right now, if you're typing something, if I said this is sick
Hmm.
into a computer, it would still assume it's negative because there's no intonation. If I said to you, "Oh man, that's sick. That's so good,"
Yeah.
like in context, that's good, right?
Absolutely.
Um,
And
re- re-
if I
yeah.
can pause you there, it might improve if you decided to build a corpus of slang language from, let's say,
Yes.
London slang, right?
Yeah.
So if you fed it a corpus of appropriate sort of terms, it would actually eventually learn. But I don't think anyone from London is doing that right now.
Maybe some researcher somewhere is sitting there and listening to this, going like, "Hang on, hang on, this is literally my doctorate right now." Um,
An NLP on English slang, that would be amazing.
right.
Okay, so we've sort of gone into the weeds there. So if we just step back out, the last thing I want to talk about is the difference between syntax and semantics. Okay, and I
Hmm.
think when you hear those two, you sometimes immediately confuse the two. You think they're the same thing, but actually, syntax is about grammar, punctuation. The things that form sort of a sentence, the rules of the language.
Yeah.
In programming, syntax is the way a programming language works, sort of the colons, the semicolons. If we talk about semantics, though, semantics is a little bit higher because it's the sort of derived meaning from those things. So when you're talking about the sentiment of something, you're arguing about the semantics.
Yeah.
Whereas when we were talking about sick and all of that, we were actually talking about syntax, sort of the lower level of, how that word comes together. And so semantics, the discussion we then had was a semantic one,
Hmm.
but the syntax, the actual construction of that sentence is a syntax based one. So that's really really important because by feeding a natural language processing sort of algorithm more information about syntax and feeding it with an appropriate sort of corpus that allows it to understand the semantics of certain language, you then start to derive better meaning. And this is really, really important when we then start to talk about natural language processing in, business intelligence.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Because this is where you need to start thinking about what kind of questions will people ask. Now, um, if I take another like leap backwards into when we mentioned machine learning, a lot
Hmm.
of times, so one of the machine learning models, the first ones I came across was on a TED talk about basketball analytics,
Okay.
and they were trying to train cameras to be able to spot one of the moves in basketball called a pick and roll. And there's so many different ways a pick and roll can happen, and with tracking data, it's hard to sort of identify that. Now, the reason I'm bringing this in is because natural language is starting to do the similar sorts of things,
Hmm.
where it's picking up conversation and like the way you're interacting with it, and trying to identify and try and articulate what you're trying to say, based on the reams and reams of information it gets. So again, if we go back to the Google example, imagine how much information Google has on a question someone asks and then the
Hmm.
web page they click on, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Because that then is feeding back into this loop and helping the model and the process understand the syntax and the semantics and then the endpoint. So it's got this entire flow of here's the question, here's what the perceived answer was,
Hmm.
and now let's go back to how we broke this down to understand how we can then improve the model. Is this this constant improvement, I think, which is the really really cool part of this technology.
Exactly, and this is why Google sort of has a massive advantage over its competitors in the search space, because Google's been having this approach, this sort of let's sort of apply machine learning to everything approach since its conception. Everything has been based on this sort of way of thinking. I think
Hmm.
the best example you and I came across is literally last night when I sent you a video of we're basically uploading a podcast onto YouTube, and the reason I was doing this is because I discovered that YouTube's transcription service is actually ridiculously good. Like,
Yeah.
I had a look at the transcript of our last podcast, the How To podcast, 14 minutes long, and went through the transcription that it did just based off listening to our video, and it only got about 10 words wrong in the whole entire thing. I
Hmm.
literally couldn't believe it. And that is something that I remember when it was launched 2 years ago
Oh
was
man, it was so
awful.
buggy.
It was so awful. You would never switch it on.
Yeah.
And someone told me you should switch it on and try it. And I've even met a couple of people who've said this in the past, and I never really twigged. They use it to transcribe video and audio, or they create sort of dictaphone files. So they'll record something on a microphone, they'll create a video out of it, just so that the Google transcription service can give them the transcript back.
Amazing.
Because it's that good. It's much easier to edit something that's already 90% there than it is to write it from scratch, right?
Yeah, I mean, editing 10 words is easier than writing. Or I mean, I transcribed a focus group once when I was at
Right.
university, and it was an hour long,
Yeah.
maybe an hour and a half. Anyway, it took me 7 hours to write it all out.
To do it properly, yeah.
Yeah, because then you basically have to listen to it on half speed, and I feel like I'm a pretty good fast typer, but
Mhm.
even then it takes a long time to type out word for word and tag and sort of structure it properly, so then I could use it back into my essay.
Exactly. And so if we now then try and start to, let's actually use the Ask Data example here. So I'm going to try and test to see if you've understood how Ask Data works in the background. Okay. So Ask Data, it's maybe useful maybe just describing what exactly Ask Data does and how it works for people who haven't used it.
Yeah, sure. So we're now very much in the so what, right? We've talked about the concept. Now let's apply it somewhere. So what? Why does this matter? So Ask Data is basically an ability. So previously on Tableau's server offering, you'd be able to log on to it and look at data sources, and then look at specific work. And when you clicked on a data source, excuse me, you'd be able to see which workbooks were connected to it. Now, that's changed slightly in the new version of Tableau, and instead of being shown the workbooks immediately, the first thing you see is Ask Data. And what this is it looks very similar to Tableau Desktop if you've seen it, with the construction of the view where you've got your dimensions and your measures, and then you can hover over these to get a quick understanding of what's underneath this data. And then there's a search bar, very much like Google, or similar to any search bar you'd have in the middle of a page. And you start typing. It's got some examples based on the data it's scanned. So it first does some metadata loading and analyzes the data set, and then gives you some examples. So if I've got a housing data set, it will show me the sum of price by district, for example. And it'll give me examples of how to write that out. Now, if I type in show me price over time, Ask Data then picks this up. It then says, okay, so you're saying show me, so you want to see something. Let me ignore that. Price, price is a field in my data. Over time will probably be over a date field, so it picks the first date field it has, or the most used date field as well.
Right. Okay, so it's a fairly nice sort of implementation. It's nice and easy thing to sort of follow, right? And so now let's try and unpick what's actually going on. So let's say I type a query, show me the sum of sales. I'm thinking like a Tableau developer now.
Yeah. Think like an actual analyst. Tim,
think like an actual human
consultant.
being, not like a consultant. All right, okay. Show me the sales for the Eastern region. Okay.
Yeah.
How would that work?
So this would probably be, you'd say, you'd type that in, I think. You'd say, show me sales in the eastern region, and it might not pick up the eastern, but
Mm-hmm.
it might do. I'm not double checked, but it seems to be able to fairly good at picking up um, both spelling errors as well as what you're trying to get at. It then gives you an autocomplete of like 2 or 3 options, and then you just
Right.
can either select one of them, and it will then pop up with the chart.
Right. So as you start to type, it's already starting to process sort of what
Hmm.
you're asking, and it's trying to sort of make sense. I think what they've done is they've obviously programmed it to understand how a question might start. So show me what is, how much, when. All those are all questions that insinuate a specific angle
Yeah,
into the data. So as soon as you start to type that, it's processing that. Okay,
yeah.
and
So
then go for it.
another example would be like giving the software the aggregation you want. So like
Mm-hmm.
average sales over time by region, right? And
Right.
then what Tableau's alongside doing that query, what the really funky stuff Tableau's doing is it's then generating the chart in the background. And of course, Power BI also does this. I think they released a feature in December. It does very much the same thing. It works in very much the same way,
Mm-hmm.
except you don't get the metadata view on the left hand side to help you out in figuring out the um, the syntax.
Right, right. And so that's kind of interesting. I've just tried it right now and I asked it the question who on our data sets, our time data set that we often look at.
Mm-hmm.
And it understood that it was actually talking about username. So it suggested the username when I said who, which is
Ah,
obviously a great field because it's gone into the field and I think figured out that this is a list of names, or it's just simply looking at the field user name and it's thinking, oh, who must refer to an individual, and name has a lot of similarity. If you go back to morphology, it's got a very sort of tangential connection with a specific individual. So
correct.
it's very cool, very cool.
Yeah, correct. That's exactly what it'll probably be doing. And this is where I mentioned that first scan. When you click on it, it will load up the data in the background and sort of summarize it and understand what your fields are meaning. So the more
Yeah.
description and detail you give to your fields when you're curating and governing your data sources,
Mm-hmm.
the better it gets.
Okay. So the next thing is sort of the aliasing. So this is a feature in our data,
Mm.
right? So what does that actually do? How does that work?
Right. So, say for example, in your database, you have your sales as transactions sold, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, some people will say sales, some people will say revenue, some
Mm-hmm.
people might say stuff we gave, like stuff we sold, stuff like that. And what you can do is you can then say so transaction value. You can right
Mm-hmm.
click and then add in and say, right, this is sales, comma, this is also might be revenue, this also might be whatever else, right? So
Right, right.
this is so this then you're giving us data the different. I guess this is semantics, right? You're
Yeah,
doing
yeah.
different types of words that would be used when
Mm-hmm.
someone's typing out a query to refer to that specific field.
Exactly, exactly. So that's pretty much it. We've sort of broken down, at least at a very, very basic level, sort of how this works. And it sort of makes sense, right? So, Tableau is kind of bringing a lot to the game here. They're bringing some of that understanding and of sort of sentiment, semantics that's built in. I think this is where ClearGraph probably did most of their research and innovation in.
Mm-hmm.
It's asking users or admins or data source admins to give their data sources context, give them a little bit more information so Tableau can understand what people mean when I say sales or profit. And those are very straightforward sort of terms. But what you hope in the future is that it's able to do calculations, because profit is a simple calculation between revenue, margin, and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah, potentially right, and I mean, right now it's sort of focusing on the sort of queries like, how many transactions were over £500 last week, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's again, if we break this down in the way that natural language unit will take it down, it'll be like, right, so how many? So we want to count something.
Mm-hmm.
Transactions, let's look for that field. So transactions could be again revenue or number of orders, whatever it could be.
Yeah.
Then it's over $500. Okay, cool. So we now need to find the field that's looking at has a value of £500 or dollars or whatever, right?
Yeah.
and then last week, and it's saying, right, let me find a date field and then segment it to just the last week from today. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
So this is going back to what Tim was explaining earlier about that the 3-step model of going from a top tier aim, medium level challenges to smaller parts. The top tier aim would be here, how many transactions over £500 last week. Then it's broken down and the sections are taken out to sort of link back into the data and pull the query out. And then the final part is the syntax and the stuff like that. So for example, how many, then the £500, and then last week rather than this week or next week, right?
And of course, you've forgotten the critical step, which is whilst it's doing all this, it's also building a SQL query to go get the data and bring it back, aggregate it, and then show it to you in a view.
Yeah, that's a small part.
there's a tiny little bit there that it's also doing. So I find it amazing that, when I did some research for this episode, I now fully appreciate how amazing things like Siri and Google. What's Google's assistant called? Google Assistant. It's just called the Google Assistant.
Yeah.
I like literally the speed at which they do what they do boggles the mind. For you to say something, it goes up to the cloud. They can process it in a nanosecond and send you a response that's almost instantaneous to you. It's like you're just having a conversation with it there. It's phenomenal.
It's fantastic, right? It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Like it's one of these things when it first comes out, you're like, oh, it's a fad. But then when you start integrating it into your life, like for example, I've got an Apple Watch, and like so when I'm like doing something or putting something on the hob, and I'm like, right, I'm not going to say it now because it'll trigger it, but like Siri set a timer for X, right, and it will do it, and yeah, it's just triggered as I've done that.
Of course it did, yeah. Sorry, everyone.
Right. Exactly. If you're listening and we've just triggered your Siri, apologies. But yeah, so it's doing that, and it's saying things. It understands what I'm trying to do, right? It understands that I'm asking it to not only set a timer, but it's then going and doing it. It's then going to the timer application, setting the timer at 10 minutes, and then saying your timer's set, and then it's also setting an alarm to trigger out back to you.
Yeah, and this is the kind of value that I think really gets businesses excited. I mean, I have to say that every decade there's a trend. Every year, sorry, there's a trend in business intelligence. What was it last year? Last year was what was the last year's trend in real sense? I think it was about speed and scale and the typical generic thing that's actually been around for the last few years.
I think it was about the speed that you get your data.
Yeah, it was about speed. So everything was about speed. This year, it's all about, how can I get stuff without doing anything?
I think it's two-pronged. This year, it's all about literacy. Like, we need to raise the literacy of our workforce.
Right.
As well as, how do I make things easier to raise the literacy for our workforce?
Exactly. And so this is really interesting because whilst we joke about this, there's actually some real sweet advantages of technology like this coming to maturity. I don't think we're there yet, but I think in the next few years, we might reach a level of maturity where we start to see a different kind of business intelligence starting to appear in businesses, right? So maybe we should just touch on a few examples. I think the first one that I actually really like the sound of, and I know I'm going to sound like a loony when I say this, but zero data movement and zero ETL. Okay,
that's wild.
Yeah, so this is a concept I read on Medium, not an author called John Thuma. I'll link it in the show notes. And I didn't quite buy his explanation of it, but that simple concept of if you can get natural language processing to understand where your data sources are, what kind of transformations or questions that people want to have done, and then do them in real time rather than having masses of data warehouses and ETL setups, sort of set up answering every single question you might possibly want to know and then persisting that in a database somewhere. That's just wild, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's also the effort to find out what the each column is, what is a record.
Exactly.
The sort of the tick list you have of data, the data sort of auditing process you do to understand and the contours of your data. I think it was mentioned. I think Ben Jones has a talk or a webinar coming up soon where he talks about the contours of the data and has this little checklist you can go through. which touches on this exactly this, and yeah,
And it's so powerful because for so long I think that those two specific things, so data movement, i.e. being able to move data from one place to another and access it, and then the ETL required on top of that, that's actually always, even today, still a big hurdle for lots of organizations to try and kind of overcome. And so this solution is a really nice one. I think the downside though is that when lots of people are asking questions, you and I don't ask questions in the same way. So how do we guarantee that we get the same the response back? If you ask what's sales in New York and I ask what's sales in New York, but I say New York in a, I don't know, weird way, is it going to give me the same thing? Like, and that's sort of a real big sort of hurdle, I think, yet to come, like understanding language in its full proper sense.
But then I think it comes back to also that when you were trying to think of an example about Superstore, right? Like you were trying, you immediately started saying it in like as if you're teaching a Tableau class, like let me show you the sum of sales of X, Y, and Z, right? So you're already thinking this different way to say an exec who would ask like, show me the transactions last week, right?
Exactly. That's a different question, but
it's a completely different question. Yeah. And you're both looking for a similar answer. Now, in terms of this, the concept of zero data and zero ETL, I don't really buy it, but I think it's reminded me that the actual big buzzword of last year was platform.
Yes, yeah.
Right, and that every single business intelligence tool was talking about itself becoming a platform, and right. I think that stuff like NLP allows Power BI, allows Tableau, allows ThoughtSpot, Arcadia, all of these different tools to be like, well, actually, we're doing this, and then actually the thing we're solving isn't the dream they sell when they pitch it to you in the sales pitch, right? Which is like your execs are now able to access your data. What I personally have found that Ask Data has made me think about a lot more is data curation, right? It's made me think about how is my data being, how are the end users interacting with it, and what do they see when they're seeing this analysis on down the left-hand panel? And it's making me think about like, but how does the data get from A to B? It's this entire data movement thing, this entire ETL thing. And this is where like the concept of platform starts to almost, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It has to be a platform, right? It has to be a platform in order to fulfill this promise.
Exactly. And that's actually a really good point. All of these things build on other things. It's excuse the analogy, but layers, right? So you're building layers upon layers of sort of platforms on each other. And in many ways, there's always this concept of you have to be able to hot swap a particular part of that layer or stack, as they call them in traditional IT, with something else. So platforms are really important because if, for example, you decide that Tableau is not the tool for you and you decide to switch in another tool, you need to be able to very easily and quickly transition to that new tool and not have to change your entire stack because you invested in sort of one sort of platform, which is actually sadly the case for a lot of organizations. They can't very easily swap out their analytics functions from their ETL processes because they typically solve the whole package in one solution.
And it's almost like vendors make it hard, right?
Yes.
Like it's kind of in their nature. They want to keep customers for life. So it's within their best interest to make it fairly difficult to move away. But I think this sort of thing being more across the board means that you can step away from that sort of thing maybe in a certain way. Now, going back to the so what, right? So we're very much within that section of the podcast, and I'd say that you mentioned that we maybe might not use NLP in a certain way, but I've actually found it that being different, right? So something that I previously would have connected to in Tableau Server and done a quick web edit to see something. I've just started using Ask Data, and it's something that I can just, because I've sat down and read and understand and thought about how this works, I feel comfortable doing that. I know it's quicker for me to get. It's almost it becomes that quick speed thing, right?
Yeah,
it's almost
quicker
for me to get that query back with a text query then connecting, waiting for it to load, then like going to a new tab, then dragging and dropping, then fiddling around and doing all this stuff. And what you said about having the technology then start building calculations for you based on the habits, like based on the fact that when someone logs in to a data source on Power BI and then they start asking a question about X, Y, and Z, it's like, wait a second. So when Tim came in earlier, he asked a very similar question to what you're asking. And then what he did was he did this calculation of to get the profit ratio. Do you also want the profit ratio? And you can be like, yes, I do.
Yes,
and it's
exactly.
done.
Exactly. And what's interesting about the way they've implemented it in Tableau is that they've actually stuck to the user interface that you're familiar with. So dimensions and measures on the left. You can see the fields, which kind of plays as a visual cue of what to ask. They've given you some suggestions, but they've just given you essentially a search box in which to type something into. And this is very interesting because it's still keeping this idea that the canvas is this sort of area below the search bar, which is actually where it's always been in Tableau, except for you've been the one building the queries, right? And so it's an interesting but important thing, because for me, I don't believe that this is sort of ready for prime time until they're confident to let you choose between what kind of interface you'd like. Would you like the Ask Data interface, or would you like the drag and drop interface? Would you like to build your own stories, or would you like to ask questions? And until they offer that choice side by side, then to me that signals that they, this still has some
It's
mileage.
a slightly different application to the
exactly.
Yeah, but I think that going we're talking now in terms of Tableau being this journey, right, with people who they start viewing and then they start wanting to do stuff and then they start wanting to build stuff and then suddenly they're this super user. Which I think works with every single software. Like you think about R and Python and all these different coding softwares. You get the exact same thing. You first start by using someone else's package. And then you start putting packages together and copying out someone else's code. Then you start writing your own code.
The Power BI sort of implementation of this isn't too far different, actually. It's very similar. It's very similar. You could argue in many ways that Tableau maybe learnt a thing or two from that interface. But I think what is still missing for me, it's this, what we're really trying to shoot for here is this world where people are empowered to ask their own questions, right? And this is really what Ask Data is trying to do, because I mean, if I step back a little bit, there used to be this dialogue around Tableau 3 or 4 years ago that it was easy, anyone could drag and drop and so on and so forth. And then in the last couple of years, it's become, not say a hard tool to use, but some of the best features are not the kind of features you can just very simply explain to, let's say, a seasoned Excel user, right? And by a seasoned Excel user, I mean someone who's obviously quite comfortable with concepts, difficult data concepts in Excel, okay? So pivot tables, lookups, all that kind of stuff, right? Try explaining a level of detail calculation. And I know I can hear the crowds of people saying it's easy and okay, I'm sorry, but it's just not. And there's more and more coming to the product, which people like you and me ask for, because we are asked to do these reports and build sort of even more complex dynamic reporting solutions. But for the everyday user, Tableau's moved away from that. And I think this is how it comes back to that person. This is how your everyday user comes back into the play, because for Tableau to move forward in that respect and allow us to build more interactive, more sort of empowering dashboards and stories, as they always say, you need to be able to cater for people at both ends of the spectrum, because there's not enough space in the interface to cram all the stuff that you want to cram in. And so you have to now differentiate between I was going to say junior developer, but that's the wrong term, a new user who's just starting with questions and doesn't have to overcome this hurdle of understanding the interface before they can answer a question, which is a great first step, right? And this other step, which is, okay, now I'm actually familiar with this. How do I transition from this search box, which is quite limiting now because I've asked all the questions I could possibly get, and transition to this thing where I can already, ask all my questions? And they transition you out of this Ask Data interface into a drag and drop interface where you can then start actually seeing how it actually works. Because you've been asking questions, you kind of use a word from earlier on, semantically understand what you need to be able to do.
Yeah, No, I'd agree with that for sure. So, Tim, where do you see natural language going? Just to sort of curb today's episode off, where do you see it
Well,
going? Like in both
it's a
business
difficult one.
intelligence and the wider world.
So here's the thing. I think we're going to see natural language. I mean, it's very, very prevalent. Spell checkers, search engines, Wikipedia, like all these systems, we use it every single day and have done for quite some time. Where it's still not there is this sort of top level of execution. If you think about Alexa, or if you think about Siri, right? It's really impressive what they do, but sometimes they get the most basic of basic things wrong. Okay.
Yeah.
And if I think back to the Google Translate example, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that was awful at transcribing audio. But now it's got 96% accuracy. And the funny thing is, because it has a 96% accuracy rate on transcribing, it has a really high hit rate on translation as well,
Right.
which is an amazing side effect, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
and that is where we're kind of not with the NLP, at least in business intelligence. We've achieved that first level of sort of ideation where you can put it into the product, and actually, there's a good feedback area in the Ask Data tool. If you don't like something it's done, you can click the feedback button. It captures your name, and you can give it your company, and you can send it the feedback right in the tool. And I think that's really, really important going forward. But I think businesses need to sort of how do I say this? Manage their expectations. I don't think it's going to solve a lot of the challenges people think it's going to solve, not in the immediate near future. I think it still requires a lot of upfront work in terms of aliasing. It's not clear how language is going to be supported. I'm pretty sure that majority of Tableau users don't speak English. If you take the total of the Tableau use base, I think most of them speak another language other than English. And so how does this work for non-native speakers? And then going back to that discussion we had earlier on, I think if you've ever been in a meeting and just sort of envisages the way people talk about metrics, right? There are just so many ways of having a discussion about any given metric that I think this software still has a long way to go in terms of being able to fully handle its own, as it were. So if I fed it a query or term that it never seen before, I don't think it's still good enough to handle itself. Whereas if you think of Google or something, whenever you ask it a question, even if it gets it wildly wrong, it uses some other sort of basis to get the right answer based on your previous history. And so something that doesn't exist today is Tableau doesn't have a history of all your questions. So this is a chance for you, Ravi, to talk about your metadata layer. Your favorite feature.
It's my favorite feature.
There's no metadata yet on the kind of questions people are asking and who's asking those questions. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, and what Tim's referring to is the left-hand panel is my favorite part of Ask Data. Like, I have this vision of this is going to help change so many different things within companies where they understand the usage of the data they're using, and it becomes this self-actualizing cycle where you can understand what fields, what workbooks, what definitions are being used within each of these different aspects of the Tableau server and data sources, and then that starts feeding back to the data source level, so you can start optimizing your queries and creating specific views. And it's just this really cool idea of trying to streamline and trying to optimize the way that you interact with data in order to stop people getting fed up or frustrated with their use of the product.
Exactly.
Now, to answer my own question about where I see natural language going, I quite like your Alexa example, because I think one of the first, I was sort of following the data cast webinar for Ask Data and looking at the hashtag and having a quick scroll down. And there was 3 or 4 people immediately like, cool, this would be amazing if you could integrate it into Alexa. And I think before we started recording, Tim, I was telling you like, oh man, I hate that concept of like, let's just put it in Alexa, because it's like, I compared it to group FaceTime. Like, everyone asked for group FaceTime for like 5 years.
Yeah.
And then we got it. And I don't know anyone that's used it. If I'm completely honest, I do not know anyone that's used a group FaceTime. Apart from
hackers, of course, yeah.
Apart from hackers who wanted to listen in on your conversations after you hung up on them. Which is obviously a bug that was announced and now has been patched. Don't worry, folks.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just feel like integrating the intellect so it isn't priority. I think people have already tried doing it. I think there was a hackathon last year, and Star Schema, among all the awesome stuff they do, they sort of built some level of solution where you can integrate Tableau and you speak to it. However, I don't think it's paramount, because I think it's something that's like you'll use it a couple of times and then get frustrated with it and be like, it's easy for me to type actually.
Pretty much, unless it's Jarvis from the Avengers, it's not going to be good enough, right?
That's like supreme artificial intelligence, and we are nowhere near that. So
exactly. But that's sort of the level of. It's funny. It's crazy. We sort of imagine these technologies in fiction, and they end up becoming almost possible in our lifetime. It's madness, but
it's crazy, right?
It's also. It's one of those things where I always have to caution people about getting fanatical and sort of claiming that it's going to answer problems. It's not going to do that this year. But I think for companies, if you're joining the business intelligence sort of bandwagon today, you've never really had a big push for business intelligence, then this is absolutely fantastic, because you've got no benchmark previously of sort of what to do. However, if you've deployed business intelligence tools to thousands of users, this is just yet another thing you're going to have to train users on, right? And so, and you have to enable it and you have to train it. There's probably not enough resources to allow you to scale that up in your organization. Which makes it a real challenge, actually. And so what happens is you just switch it off. You don't even switch it on, and you end up becoming stagnant as a result of that. And so I'm hoping what Tableau does is they learn from the users who are using it. They apply some of that learning. They open up some more useful ways to interact with this model, whether it's through typing or even a microphone or some other sort of examples, or even something silly like using the typed questions as chart suggestions, so that when someone's building a chart, they already have a list of charts that people have asked, from Tableau server. That would be awesome. Bring some of that into the product, and from there you then have a really sort of solid basis of which you can start to see, okay, this is the journey of how this is going to affect my business, and this is how it's going to do good. I think the simplest one, again, something that you've talked widely about, is being able to understand what questions do people actually want to answer, because we build reports, and often I'm always in this situation where you talk to mid-level to senior management and they talk about one set of KPIs. You go to the ground and you talk to the people who actually use the report and they talk about a completely different set of KPIs.
Right. And it's
you're
two
stuck in the middle,
things.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so natural language it's a cool concept. I quite enjoyed like reading about it and finding out more about it. And you always end up back at AI and machine learning, because that's basically what it's built on. But it's just taking on this incredibly complex field of text analytics and kind of making it a bit more accessible, which I think is really cool.
I think we've got a show there.
Yeah.
That's been a very interesting topic. Thank you for listening. You can always find our show notes in the podcast app of choice, or you can find them on 3whatspod.com. Just simply go to this episode. This has been season 2, episode 3, and we'll catch you in a couple of weeks' time.
Excellent. Nice one. Take care, and we'll speak to you soon.